Today we're going to work through dealing with your landlord. In the past we've looked after substantial businesses that are generally landlords, and one of the issues that we faced a lot was where we were the last to know that something was wrong. A lot of people don't realise that the landlord generally holds most of the power. So what we see a lot of times is clients will come in, they'll have their bank under control, they'll have the ATO under control, they'll have the suppliers under control, but no one's talked to the landlord. Now the landlord, depending on the lease, can terminate under a lot of circumstances, and he doesn't really need to give you a lot of notice. So if you go into liquidation or administration, the lease can be torn up straight away. And regardless of the strategy you've put in place, if you don't have the landlord on side, then any structure is going to fall apart. So it's important to remember they generally have most of the power. This is really an issue that can damage a lot of businesses, where the landlord can control what happens from the point that they realise there's financial difficulties to any solution you come up with, whether that's selling the business, restructuring, or assigning the lease to a third party. In each of those cases, the landlord needs to give consent, and there may not be a financial interest in him doing so. So one of the first things that we do when we deal with any client looking to restructure is look at what's going on with the lease. Now, depending on where the property is located, depending on what it is, there's different rules depending on what's actually going to happen. So we look at what the landlord's actually looking for. Now, ideally a landlord wants a secure tenant, but is the property up for redevelopment, or is the property going to require substantial reinvestment? Equally, is it a specific use asset? So is there not really a lot of tenants who can move into this property? Now, there's a big difference between a shed and, say, a motel, where a motel only has a certain amount of users that could actually take it over, whereas an industrial shed could have multiple users. So if you're a business that's running in an industrial shed, you may not have a lot of options. But equally, if there's a lot of vacancies around you, it may be simple enough to close the doors and move next door. Looking at this in each case is where the landlord needs to be brought into the conversation. So what can you offer them? In a lot of cases, the rent may be delayed. They may be wanting their rent paid in full. But equally, a lot of landlords these days are actually commercial and will look for a solution to keep you in place. Now, especially in the retail industry, there's a lot of pressure put upon landlords to drop the rents. Certainly Westfield have been very reticent to do so, but in smaller locations we've seen where landlords are willing to drop rents in order to keep a tenant in place. For industrial properties, generally, a landlord will be willing to negotiate where they can get a longer lease, especially where the property isn't being redeveloped. And for specific use assets, they will look at profitability. And I use the motels as an example where we have substantial experience with that, where we've seen landlords drop rents by 50 to 80% in order to keep a tenant in place. But what do you need to know? The landlord has full control. He can lock the doors on you, and then what have you got? You've got some assets that are sitting under his control, but ultimately everyone has to deal with him. So if you have a specific use asset and he can go over and take it over from you, say as a motel or a pub, then you may have nothing to negotiate with. And leaving the landlord out of the loop is one of the biggest risks you can take if you're looking to restructure or take control back of your business. It's important to come to commercially sensible outcome. If you leave the landlord out of the loop and then turn around to him and say he's got to take a rent reduction, he's going to ask why. But if you're communicating early, trying to deal with him and coming to a solution, then there's a good chance that your landlord will agree to something. Now, if you're in a rural area or a small country town, the chances of negotiation are a lot higher than, say, a building in Sydney where there is a redevelopment opportunity and the landlord would be happy to get rid of you. One thing that we do say is look at what the building can do, or look at what the premises can do. Now, if there's a lot of vacancy around, this puts the power back to you, and the last thing the landlord wants is an empty building. Now, in Brisbane at the moment, commercial property is very, very low tenancy. So there's an opportunity, if something goes wrong, to look around and maybe reduce the rent. Or equally go back to the landlord and say, this is what market is. If I'm to survive, I need to go back to market. But again, it's all depending on the market, depending on the asset, and depending on what the business is. So if you have any questions about this or you need some guidance, feel free to give us a call on 1300 023 782.